Hello everyone, welcome to Module 2. This is the second week of our course. This week we're going to be reading Chapter 3. It's the only chapter that we have to read this week, so I'm going to be spending a little bit more time just talking about one chapter. Again, this is just an introduction and a little bit of a synopsis interjected with some other fun facts. The real material that will be most useful for the assignments is the book reading. It is the videos that are provided for the discussion. So with that said, moving into Chapter 3, we're going to be looking specifically at early human technology and what life was like for humans in a material aspect. What did they have to work with, and how did their technologies help them to survive? These are the sorts of questions that archaeologists of this time period are interested in. And this will start out by addressing the most common technological package of Paleo times. This would be the lithic stone tool kit. Lithic meaning stone, right? So stone technology had been in use for a few million years, and this was well prior to the modern human emergence in Africa. But it is from this emergence and use of stone tools that the tradition of science first formed their ideas around time and its progression up until now, or up until that time period. So we will see that this discussion emerged out of a time period following the Enlightenment period in Europe, where science was becoming increasingly relied on to inform governing bodies about some of the discrepancies now evident in the world. The existence of the Americas was certainly a part of those list of discrepancies, and probably the biggest discrepancy at that time between the 15th and 17th centuries. So yeah, I just want to remind you that governments at that time were very concerned with how to deal with the indigenous people in these places that they had discovered, and often looked to scientific and philosophic ideas at that time to justify certain actions and social beliefs. We know a lot of this to be rooted in the racist tradition of science, and that not only perpetuated but supported ideas like the transatlantic slave trade and the systematic genocide and forced assimilation to cultures of European tradition and their own power consolidation. Ultimately, we will see that a lot of this understanding actually emerged from quite a bit of ignorance and amnesia around the idea of what humanity was in the past, particularly in Europe, and what the material items that were left behind actually were and meant for humanity ended up changing in this time period. And so over time, evidence built up to the point where it was increasingly more obvious that there was a stone tool tradition in Europe as there was in other places in the world. The task then became to think about these tools in terms of time and to help Europeans position themselves in a linear model of progress that showcases how they had progressed, transcended actually the confines of the earlier forms, and that had many reasons they had many reasons then to have a rationale on why this linear model was correct. Adversely, it worked to position other societies as less evolved, less accomplished, inferior, and therefore justifiably subjugated. All because their societies did not match the concept of progress that Europeans had constructed to view themselves in. Nonetheless, this traditional view of progress took off and became hugely popular throughout nearly every aspect of the developing societies at that time. We can see this expressed through the rise of antiquity and the antiquarian movement. Subsequently, this can be attributed to the premise for which the idea of museums rise out of, as nations found that they had to reconcile with the plundering and looting that the citizens of their newly formed nations had committed, while still perpetuating the dominative stance that the nation had itself. However, all of this develops in historical time period as this is going on, especially in the 1800s when science had fully taken hold of the conceptual orientation that governance now had. It is constantly informed by and structured by scientific thoughts on time and on antiquity. Perhaps the ancient past had never been more impactful for society as it was during this time period, including now. This is what gave rise to a lot of scientific racism, and the rhetoric and policies that governments issued during this time mirror this, with notions of manifest destiny, of pioneering, seemingly constant warfare against indigenous people of the Americas, the creation of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and the subsequent boarding school policies they passed that sought to kill the Indian and save the man. And so I just want to add this kind of historical context to all of what we're reading in terms of how our ideas about time and antiquity emerged alongside other sociological ideas and philosophies at that time. So after we pass through the bit of the chapter that talks about how our conceptions of time rose out of this period of scientific knowledge production, and how it contributed to the time period concepts that archaeologists still use today, such as the Neolithic and Paleolithic, we will see just how these tools were made and how we can use that knowledge to identify the earliest tools that our hominid ancestors developed. Again, providing a strong technological link between modern humans and hominid species. We will also see how this becomes some of the first forms of relative dating technique to establish how old or recent a material might be. They use things such as index fossils. Index fossils are essentially used as geologic indicators, be it fossils or bedrock stratigraphy, to identify the hominid species that existed when material like a stone tool or some other fossilized species existed. So, for example, if we find that a lithic projectile point was a turd in the ground with a fossilized mammal that was perhaps killed by that interred projectile, and then we find that that same exact style and type of projectile point is in a grave with the remains of Homo habilis, we can start to make the association that these items, the tool, Homo habilis, and the fossilized mammal, all existed at the same time, and it could be that Homo habilis is responsible for the death of that fossilized mammal, meaning Homo habilis hunted this animal during that time. So this information, especially the information on the mechanics of stone tool making, how they're actually made, what terms we use to describe that process archaeologically, will be really useful for this week's workbook exercise on lithics. It's a good portion to pay attention to do well on that workbook. A little side plug here is if you are interested in the time periods that are discussed in this chapter in particular, and in general about how humans evolved into modern Homo sapiens, the Anthropology department has an introductory course on the subfield that specializes more so in these early biological and technological developments. It's called Introduction to Physical Anthropology instead of Introduction to Archaeology. So as we progress to the end of stone tools in this chapter, we will see how the existence of these tools impacted the evolution of modern Homo sapiens, and then we will go on to see what innovations occurred. In particular, we will read about metal technology and see how, when, and where some of these early transitions from stone technologies to metal technologies happened for Homo sapiens. This means starting off with the Chalcolithic period and the early bronze working that emerges when we find evidence of mining, smelting, and the casting of copper ore, which is the natural mineral that generated what we call bronze. Nearing the end of this chapter, we will take a look at the perishable items and perishable materials that existed during these time periods where metalworking had become so utilized. The Otzi example, or Otzi, I really don't know how you say it. I think it might be Otzi. The Otzi example that the book goes into will provide a much more human perspective on our ancestors of the past, one that is not just about the production of technology for acquiring basic human biological needs. In fact, culture and personality itself was very alive and well during these times, and Otzi stands as a symbol of that expression. Also, he shows us some of the details about the tool package of the Neolithic period and how it wasn't all stones and it wasn't all metal. The chapter then finishes with a crucial interpretation on the relations between technology and the environment and the Anthropocene. This perspective is probably the most significant in the chapter in terms of being able to apply an understanding of these technological developments to those of today's technologies. Again, the relationship between technology, the environment, and the Anthropocene have not only changed and persisted, they have greatly intensified. So that's something to keep in mind when we're finishing up the reading for this week. So I'm just going to leave you here with a quick assignment reminder. We have 2 assignments. You have the second discussion of the course, and you have the second workbook. For the second discussion, make sure that you watch the short film. It's about 45 minutes long on flint knapping with Dr. Bruce Bradley. You will need that information for this week's discussion. Again, remember that you have at least 2 total submissions per person, per group. And you have 1 summary piece that's submitted by someone in your group that comprises all of the submissions for that week to be made. So 3 total per group. Most people will be doing 2, but whoever is the reporter will be doing that 3rd submission. And they'll be writing up the summary. And I just want to make a suggestion that you get all of those in by Friday night, all of your individual submissions by Friday night at the latest, so that you can give the reporter a couple days to work with your submissions and write up a summary piece. This is really important if you want a good grade on the group discussion assignment, the timeliness of getting those submissions in. And then the second workbook, it's going to be on lithics. Make sure you're not only downloading the Word doc for this workbook, you need to be submitting your answers on Carmen in the format design, the interface design for your answers. Even if you get these wrong, or perhaps it is graded wrong by the Carmen auto grader, don't worry, I will adjust this so you will get full credit for completion. If you have questions about these answers, right or wrong, just send me a message and I will address it. And that's really it. Keep an eye out for the discussion recap video that I'm going to be posting in the middle of this week. This will address all of the discussion work that you did last week, talking about some things that we need to improve on, giving a little bit of a summary, and maybe giving some more insight to some things that people had questions about. Okay, so I will leave you with that. Enjoy your reading this week and happy learning. See ya.